Everybody ready? Morning's press briefing. I must apologize for the 5-minute late start. And at this press conference, Minister and First Vice President, Mr. Carl Greenidge, will give us an update on his recent trip with President Granger to Brussels, Belgium, during June 7 and 8. As customary, Minister will make an opening statement, followed by questions on his opening remarks, and once time permit, any other question outside of today's topic. I will now hand you over to Minister Greenidge.
Thank you very much, sir. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Director General and staff of the Ministry. I bid you all welcome and thank you all for coming in this morning. I'm proposing to say a few words. Thank you very much. I'm proposing to say a few words on the official visit that took place to Brussels, as indicated. But before I start, allow me to say one thing, if I may. I don't know how many of you were at the parliamentary session yesterday. I just thought that given what occurred, it perhaps is appropriate to say a couple of words. And what I mean is this. We had 3 motions to begin the session yesterday, and those 3 motions dealt with 3 former ministers of government, 3 colleagues of mine, and I was very pleased to see, and I don't say this to be contentious, but to commend the PPP and Bishop Edghill in particular for the solemn and respectful way that they contributed to that debate yesterday to mark the contributions of former Minister of Finance and Trade, Mr. Frank Hope, as well as Messrs. Fitzcarmichael and Malcolm Corica. I take the opportunity to say this because all 3 of them, I had the privilege of working with all 3 of them at some stage. Fitzcarmichael had been the chairman of what is called Matakai, Matthews Ridge, Arakaka, Kaituma Authority in the Northwest. He was chairman of that board, and I was a member of the board even as I was teaching at UG. And of course, Malcolm Corica, as I think was omitted, was in fact the junior Minister of Trade when I was Minister of Finance, Trade and Planning. So he worked with me for quite some time, and I knew him quite well, and I'm sad at his loss. Fitzcarmichael, as it happened, came in to see me only the week before he died to this very office. I hadn't seen him in many years. So I was, I was pleased that those who occupy the same corridors today could see it fit to treat them with the appropriate degree of respect. It has not always been the case. We seem to be so politicized that we can be at times completely disrespectful of people simply because they hold different political views. So I just wanted to start there. It is on a different matter, but I wanted to make that point. The President of Guyana was invited, along with a few other heads of ACP states, that's the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of states, to attend the European Development Days session in Brussels on the 7th and 8th of this month. The significance of European Development Days is that it is an extremely large gathering which is intended to promote and perhaps give an opportunity for the airing of the European Union's activities, goals, and actual performance in the arena of development in its widest sense. In some years, there have been as many as 6,000 participants in that meeting, and when I was the director of the Technical Center for Agricultural and Rural Cooperation, the CTA in the Netherlands, it was something that we participated in. This particular event has been going for some 11 years, and it was a very fruitful meeting, I thought. It's opened with, well, first of all, the President of the European Commission extended the invitation to President Granger, and the event also featured at that opening session a variety of heads of ACP states and of European states. There was the Prime Minister of Norway. You had also the presidents of Senegal, Ghana, President Condé of Guinea, and the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, and Ms. Mohammed, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. So it's just to give you an idea that this was a very high-level meeting. The Europeans used that title. A high-level meeting in that context means that it covered a number of heads of state, heads of the European community itself, and a number of other persons who represent international institutions. And so the meeting gave the community a chance to showcase itself. The opening session, at which the president, together with his other colleagues, had an opportunity to make statements. The president addressed a range of development issues, but also the idea, the development, the concept of the Green State in relation to Guyana. Subsequent to that opening session, there was a panel discussion, and in that panel, there was also presentations by, or participation by, Mr. Mimica, who is the Director General of the European Commission Department, European Commission Division responsible for development. He is the top commissioner responsible for development and all development matters. So when we speak of Cotonou, or as it used to be called, Lomé, and you're speaking of the relationship between the European Union and the ACP group, between the Caribbean and the European Union, he is the top technician. A technician in that sense is perhaps just a technical term. He's halfway between a full-fledged minister and a technician. In addition to him, you had Mr. Louis Michel. Louis Michel is a former minister of the Belgian government. He is currently the chairman of the Joint Parliamentary Assembly, that is a body putting together ACP parliamentarians and European parliamentarians. You would have heard of MEPs. These are the segment of the European Union, the European community, that deals with the legislative and the wider matters of policy of the European Union. It is a very powerful group. So Louis Michel participated in that discussion along with President Granger. There was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Rwanda, also amongst those who participated. And that gave President Granger an opportunity to address the expectations of the ACP group as regards the new arrangements between the European Union and the ACP that will take us beyond the year 2020. The current arrangement, that is Cotonou, the Cotonou Agreement should formally come to an end, at least this phase of it, in 2020. I don't know what it will be called after that. I believe there's an intention on both sides to have it continue, but there is a debate as to the form of the arrangement between the two sides, whether the ACP group will sit on the one hand as the ACP, or whether they will be broken up into Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific. African Union, Caribbean separately, and the Pacific separately. And the type of instrument, whether there should be a legal obligation when the EU signs if let us say the successor to Cotonou, whether they would be obliged, as is currently the case, to honor the commitments in terms of funding that are contained in that agreement. Cotonou, as you know, Cotonou and its predecessor Lomé are unique North-South accords. They're the only ones that carry a fora or a standing platform in which the two sides automatically at the end of a defined period conduct negotiations, and in the period between those negotiations where they are obliged to review performance, review implementation, and platforms, standing bodies, there are customs bodies, there are bodies dealing with trade arrangements, bodies dealing with culture and others that review performance and adjust as they go along. So those presentations on Cotonou were very important. The president was there as the president of Guyana, but of course he is currently the chairman of the Caribbean CARICOM Heads of Government conference. And so he was able to give an indication of our interests. In fact, I should say that the panel itself was intended to give the European Union an opportunity to tell us what they wanted. They have already arrived at a position as to what they would like, and in a sense it was partly an intention to try to persuade and influence us to embrace their vision. We recognized that and took the opportunity to say to them what we thought and what we didn't want as part of that arrangement. But as you know, the negotiation of the new facility has not yet begun. This is the preliminaries, the sort of the wooing that takes place before the marriage, and that is what this was about. Attending these two sessions was also the Queen Mathilde of Belgium, or as they would say, the Queen of the Belgians, and a number of other persons of some importance. There was also a dinner at which I think there were only 7 persons, including the President, the Queen, Prime Minister, and others. So these were exceedingly high-level and important meetings as configured by the European Union. There were no other Caribbean leaders invited. And you had others. I don't want to list all of them. You had also, for example, the President Kagame of Rwanda. The dinner was also an opportunity for the invited guests to say something about the issues they regarded as important. So they addressed international issues ranging from terrorism to development and problems of the reconfiguration of the world, as it were, and the uncertainty governing international relations. We also took the opportunity as we were there to have meetings, bilateral meetings. There was a meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister and his team, Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium. The Prime Minister himself was caught up at the last moment. We also had a meeting with Louis Michel himself. As I said, he is the President of the Joint Parliamentary Assembly. And we saw him specifically to address an issue that has caused us some concern. The European Union has arrangements in place, as you probably will be aware of, governing all sorts of things, including money laundering and drug trafficking. They have, in the context of anti-money laundering efforts and the financing of terrorism, these are critical issues at this point in time, a list. As you know, people like to refer to these as blacklists. They have a blacklist which they put together some time ago, and which surprisingly, and I say surprisingly because when you consider the other people on the list, it is really absurd that Guyana could find itself on a list of about 5 countries. that are blacklisted in the context of anti-money laundering, however bad the administration could have been, because our impact and influence internationally can only be small. And whilst it is true that the previous government was accused of harboring, facilitating, and doing a whole set of things that helped money laundering and the like, we have not been fingered in any way in relation to terrorism to any significant or meaningful extent. And so it's amazing that we should be on that list. But we find ourselves on that list together with countries that include Afghanistan. And that has happened notwithstanding that in 2015, Guyana passed legislation which, as you know, was the product of work by the two parties, but more importantly, in which this current administration, when in opposition, required that mechanisms of oversight that would protect the community from abuses by the executive, and in which the appointments, the advertising of positions to head the FIU, for example, are done in a transparent way. The advertisement is put out by the Parliament itself, and then the selection committee of the Parliament actually goes through the applications, and a process that is open to everyone in which political parties are present. So, not so that they can appoint who they want, but so that they are looking at each other, and you can't have cousins and political hacks being appointed without somebody knowing and without them vetoing it. We have, in that sense, a unique system, notwithstanding the nonsense, for example, that was told to us by the government prior to 2015 regarding the desirability or acceptability of that arrangement. It has been acceptable. It is one of the most transparent that I've seen anywhere, and therefore we are very proud of it. As you know, I was part of that committee and played a role specifically in relation to suggesting and ensuring that arrangements about governance are in place. I say this because after all that work had been done, after legislation has been passed, we passed one set of legislation. We also passed a subsequent set of legislation on anti-terrorism, in which sometimes I think some people feel that the penalties are too heavy, only to find that the European Commission, looking at the list which included Guyana, the European Commission recommends to the European community, to the Council, that is the highest level of decision-making, that the list be amended so as to take off Guyana. And the European Council refused. And Mr. Louis Michel is an important player in that committee, and so we addressed our concerns to him. We also had a word with Madam Judith Sargentini, who is a European Member of Parliament, very active in this arena. I gather that a number of the European parliaments, looking at the Panama Papers, you probably, I think all of you should have heard of the Panama Papers. I was looking to see whether anyone is young enough not to know. This is merely a matter of a couple of years ago. Well, if you don't know, it's got nothing to do with youth. It has to do with whether you read current affairs or not, in which there was the exposure of a number of governments and individuals who had links in that could, and bank accounts in various places that possibly could have been illegal in their countries, possibly could have been facilitating money laundering and the like. And that got many people excited, and immediately many of the European members of Parliament called for stronger legislation, tighter measures. For example, one of the countries in which ministers were identified and lots of allegations made, not substantiated necessarily, was Malta. The Prime Minister of Malta, incidentally, was there. He's in the chair of the council, and we work closely with Malta in the context of the Commonwealth. Anyway, we raised this with the two MEPs, and they undertook to try to ensure that this matter was corrected. In truth, they said it actually had nothing to do with Guyana. What had happened was that this attempt to revise the list, they believe, should have been informed by Europeans' specific criteria. They shouldn't simply revise the list because Guyana, for example, which is a member of the FATF, you would have been hearing a lot of that from the Minister of Finance and the Attorney General, and CFATF. These are the international and the regional bodies looking at, if you like, governance as regards anti-money laundering and the financing of terrorism, looking at countries' legislation, countries' implementation, prosecution, and trying to ensure that there are common standards across the globe and that countries don't merely put legislation in place but also enforce them. So FATF looked at Guyana's legislation. At one time we were on a grey list. In 2016 we were removed from those lists, and I have arrived at a point where we are going through a different phase. We will be examined like anyone else, but we are no longer the subject of the type of scrutiny that had been the case prior to 2016 and 2015. And yet, the Europeans who are a member of FATF, they contribute to the rules of FATF, they contribute to the assessments, and they participate in the work of FATF, have, notwithstanding that the clearance by FATF sought to, and actually put Guyana on a list, or maintain Guyana on a list, in circumstances that are completely unjustified. What they explained was it was really part of if you like, a struggle to ensure that the Commission uses European criteria rather than simply accepting the word of FATF. Well, you know, that to me is a completely absurd and unacceptable situation. You can't be at one time the member of a body governing world affairs and at the same time seeking to enforce on other people additional criteria which you can't get acceptance of within, or you never even put to the world body of which you're a member. So that was the exercise we undertook in relation to the discussions with the two members of the European Parliament, and we have undertaken to have the embassy in Brussels follow up this matter with them so that if they need additional information, if they need any support, or if there's anything we can do prior to their next meeting, we will be in a position to provide it. I expect within, before the 1st of August, they should meet again to look at that listing. I don't think there can be any guarantee that we will be taken off the list, because the process that they're seeking to impose or to have respected has not found agreement across the board within their bodies. So it may take a little while longer, but they've given us the assurance that we will not be damaged, at least within the European community, in the interim. So that is the nature of the discussions. The team was a relatively small team. The President, myself, the Belgian ambassador, some officers from our ambassador in Belgium, the ambassador to the Kingdom of Belgium and to the European Union, and supporting officers from the embassy and some of the President's close supporting staff. That, I hope, gives you a feel for the importance of the meeting, its flavor, its import. Perhaps I should say before I close that the significance of Cotonou and the European community is this. The European community, for the region, forget the rest of the world, for the region, is the largest source of concessional financing. By that I mean, if you need money, whether it is balance of payment support or money to fund roads, sea defenses, agriculture, and the like, you can get grants, which means that you get money which does not have to be repaid. Or you can get loans, and loans come in various forms. They can be loans with soft interest rates, 2%, 1.5%, or they may be loans that carry usurious rates, meaning that you have to pay interest rates 15, 20, 25% per annum, whilst you're trying to service the loan. You have to, whilst you're trying to repay the principal, you have to service the loan at those rates. European Union provides grant financing. Only grant financing we get from the European Union. And therefore, it is a partner that we need to keep close to us, because for a country like Guyana, struggling to develop with challenges as regards per capita income, we are interested in concessional financing and, of course, especially grants. So it is the largest contributor to the region and in particular to Guyana in this regard, and therefore it is important that we ensure that the future envelope, that the future arrangement for cooperation between the ACP and the EU takes account of our needs. We are a middle-income country, and there are problems for middle-income countries because there is a principle of what they call graduation. Least developed countries like Haiti, this is the only one in the region which is least developed, get special terms, special consideration as regards trade. Those that are middle-income countries get fewer concessions and are not eligible outside of the European Union, and in some of the instruments it has, they are not eligible for soft financing. So if you are to benefit from the menu on offer by this community, you need to be in there speaking to them when they're fashioning policy and when they're looking at problems and performance of different countries. And that is really what we were trying to ensure, that our voices were heard. President also took the opportunity to meet with some of the Caribbean ambassadors and, more importantly, addressed the ACP Committee of Ambassadors. Now, the ACP group, which is based upon the Georgetown Agreement signed here in 1975, the ACP group operates under the aegis of an ACP Heads of Government Summit. But the body that keeps an eye and ensures that the group works and fashions its policy is the ACP Council of Ministers. So all 79 countries of the ACP group, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, participate in these meetings, make decisions. But when the council isn't meeting, the ACP Committee of Ambassadors meet at the headquarters of the ACP group, which is in Brussels. And they look at all the different agreements, they negotiate with the EU, and ensure implementation is in accordance with what has been agreed. He addressed the Committee of Ambassadors. As I say, 79 countries are represented at the level of Committee of Ambassadors, ranging from Papua New Guinea, Botswana, Eritrea, and the like. So he was able to do that and leave with them his thoughts on the future of the group, the value he ascribes to them, the importance he pays to maintaining the group as a whole, having a framework agreement that will ensure all the key issues are contained in that agreement and applies to everyone, and not as per the EU preference, which is to treat with the African Union. It's a larger grouping, it's a bigger market, it has more least developed countries in it, and it is easier for them. They have the problem a little bit like a bank. I don't know how many of you might be bankers or often lend money to people, but you will know that it's easier to manage loans to big customers than to try to deal, one big customer, than to try to deal with 20 or 30 big customers hidden in all corners of Georgetown and able to become invisible when you're looking to get your money repaid. So they prefer to deal with the bigger grouping, and we have to ensure that they understand that the purpose of the Cotonou Agreement is not for the convenience of the EU, but it is a joint agreement. It is a partnership in which the circumstances and requirements of both sides need to be taken into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. And at this point, we will entertain some opening statement.
much to be successful in Cotonou. I was controller of regional affairs at Caribbean. I know you said that the preliminary stages would have having some thoughts at this point. And what are some of the criteria of the on the move of Guyana from this list? Because it's talked about the EU criteria not necessarily matching that those of FATF. And have we considered those and juxtaposed against what we're doing to see what we can fix as regards to the EU's expectations?
Many thanks. Thank you, Janelle. Well, as regards the thoughts, yes, there have been a couple of rounds of deliberations as regards the future of Cotonou in the ACP group. So the ACP group, the Committee of Ambassadors is the first point of reference. They've been meeting and they have put together recommendations and suggestions from experts and from the individual countries, the 79 countries. At some point, they appointed an eminent persons group, which had included President Jagdeo at some stage. Well, so they had an eminent persons group. Former President Obasanjo led that group, and they made some recommendations. President Obasanjo made a presentation to the ACP summit in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea last year. And so the group has recommendations that it can over which it may deliberate. They had hoped that those recommendations could somehow find their way to the regions and be examined at the highest level, such as by the AU, or at least if not by the AU as a whole, by the heads of state of the East African Community, SADC, and the like. And that is with those groups. In those regions, in fact, there have been meetings on the Eminent Persons Report. The same applies to the Pacific. In the Caribbean, for reasons best known to the Caribbean, and I don't want to speculate on them now, though the presentation from the Eminent Persons Group has not taken place, although it was decided, it was recommended at some point, and I believe that it had been decided at the heads, the heads last year, that arrangements would be made for President Obasanjo, or a representative of the Eminent Persons Group, to make a presentation so that we understand the thinking and the issues that the eminent persons would have had in their mind. Some of the ones that they had in mind have to do with the structure of the ACP group, what to do about the Secretariat, what rules should govern the appointment of a Secretary General, how should he be overseen, whether you should simply rely upon the ambassadors in Brussels, a place where from time to time ambassadors, when they believe their terms are coming to an end, engage in all sorts of activities in order to get themselves appointed, for example, as Secretaries General or Assistant Secretary. That is to get on the staff of the Secretary. That is a dysfunctional set of activities because they are there to fashion policy and to ensure that the interests of the group are represented. So the Eminent Persons Group recognized that this was a problem, that the ACP countries as a whole have to pay attention to what is going on in Brussels, have to fashion rules ranging from whether there should be age limits for those serving as Secretaries General, Assistant Secretary General, and the like, and whether ministers or a policy team from the capitals should periodically oversee the work of the Secretariat and protect the Secretariat to some extent from the type of interference that emanates from the Committee of Ambassadors. They have given thought to whether or not the envelope, that is the funding going to the group, should be available to everyone or whether there should be priorities. They have given thought to whether, for example, amongst the priorities, we should speak to technology and science and technology. Traditionally, in the ACP group, the preoccupations are trade. That's where it started. You got development finance, trade, cultural, and related matters. These are the three major envelopes. More recently, the trade element has been taken out of the EDF proper, the Development Fund, and it's been put into EPAs. You would have heard a lot about EPAs, the Economic Partnership Agreement. This is an agreement only to do with trade and the support of trade, intended to ensure that the European Union and the ACP region or an ACP country sign a trade agreement, and that is, as far as possible, an agreement that can bring the two together as partners, as in the equivalent of, let us say, of a customs, let us say a customs union, arrangements of that type. There are, I think, at least 15 or 20 issues that the teams have identified, either in Brussels or at the level of the Eminent Persons Group. And those are available to all the countries. In Guyana, we are working on that. We are trying to strengthen our own trade capacity in recognition of that need. CARICOM is supposed to, and the CARICOM Secretariat is supposed to make arrangements to ensure that the discussions take place and the level of analysis is raised so that the region can have a position, which position can be represented when the ACP group starts to sit together to examine the different issues. So,
having just completed this recent goals and under the upcoming CARICOM, is that something that Guyana will implement and restart the discussion or some kind of action there?
well, we have raised this matter several times at the level of the quoted heads of government and elsewhere. I believe that in the region there is some confusion. Let me just take a minute to explain something to you. This set of media houses that you represent, for example, will have been aware that since Brexit, for example, more attention has been focused upon Brexit than on Cotonou. When you think about it, it's ridiculous. I have said that the largest source of development funds to this region is Cotonou, and yet we've spent more time talking about Brexit. The United Kingdom has decided to leave the European Union. It is a significant, but it is only one of 27 members of the European Union. We have an agreement with the European Union which is a firm agreement, almost legally binding, at least on the European Union's part. So the commitment of funds to the region will not be affected in any significant way by Britain's departure. And yet we are worrying over Britain's departure. Why? There is great confusion over where our own interests lie, and even understanding the arrangements that we are party to. So it is true that when Britain leaves, our exports to Britain, if we don't do anything about it, will attract tariffs or taxes. And if you're exporting sugar to Britain and there's a tax on the sugar, the prices of our sugar will be higher, and therefore the demand for our sugar will be less than it would be if there were no taxes. So, of course, there are some things to be done. It's an area of concern. But for the region as a whole, I don't think anywhere in the region does, for example, exports to Britain constitute anything like 20% of GDP or 20% of export earnings, or even 16%. I think it stands somewhere at 6%. And so we can sometimes get confused. So the need to understand where we sit perhaps is an urgency, because if we did, then we will know where our energies should be directed. So it is a region that's confused in that sense. And you faster get a discussion within CARICOM on Brexit than on Cotonou. So, okay, yes, okay, that's because you came back to So, with a supplementary question, but the EU criteria as regards anti-money laundering and related matters are not known to me at this point in time. I don't know them to be any different from the criteria, but what they would like, or the MPs would like, I understand, is criteria developed by the European Union that can be applied. At this point in time, I am not aware that a consistent and separate set of criteria has been established and enforced. It is just that in looking at the global situation, some countries appeared, when they were looking at the Panama Papers, some countries were identified, names came up, and they therefore did not want the list amended as it would be as per normal. Okay.
Mr. Dennis Morgan,
Yes, Dennis.
sir, could you see how does Guyana hope to prove its case to both the United States and the FATF mechanisms that it is not a money laundering jurisdiction beyond the talk of rejection? How do you hope to prove your case? And secondly, how well is the Caribbean performing at the level of the Caribbean EPA? And what more can be done to ensure that everything performs for the parties' benefit, including the business of the country?
Thank you. Again, these are important questions. The question of proving our case on the international arena is one that, at this point in time, I think is not a major concern to us in this sense. Since 2015, we have done all that has been required of us by FATF. The international body was reviewing Guyana's performance since 2009. There was a report. In 2011, there was another report. Subsequently, there were other reports. At the time of the big debate in Guyana, in Parliament, we had not implemented all of the most serious things that they had raised. The criminalization of certain things, the seizure of assets and things like this. That has all been done now. And consequently, we have been removed from that list. We're not being monitored with anything like that level of specificity by FATF. And the reports, if, for example, both of FATF, I don't have them before me, but I have them somewhere in the car because I was looking at them yesterday, and from the U.S. administration, the State Department, which is part of the international body or contributes or assesses what is going on, there is a very favorable report on implementation and performance by Guyana. In terms of legislation, in terms of the establishment of the FIU, in terms of reports by the FIU, in terms of staffing and appointments in the FIU, oversight of the FIU. Whilst there was an FIU in place, for example, until 2014, it had never submitted a report. Okay? And until that time, until 2016, nobody had ever been prosecuted for money laundering or any assets seized in terms of money laundering. And so that has now been corrected. It is, I must say, an ongoing process. So you can't say, well, we satisfied the criteria on the 15th of June 2017 and therefore there's nothing else to be done. It's a constant process. But at this point in time, we have done all that has been required of us. So that, as regards the Europeans, since they are party to the FATF discussions, deliberations, and requirements, I believe that it should be sufficient for it to be drawn to their attention that we have met the FATF standards and that FATF has removed us from their list of countries monitored and those that are on the shadow list or any other list. We are not on any list suggesting infringements. No.
To the second question, Minister. Here now you're talking about regulations and standards and FIE, but does Guyana have the hard data to make a case to show that there are no traces of dirty money passing through the system?
Well, the FATF does not require of any country that they do that. You know that the United States, for example, can't even suggest that there is no trace of money laundering taking place there. But what it does, what the United States does, better than many others, sometimes not entirely in keeping with the legislation outside of the United States and questionable sometimes inside, is to monitor and enforce, so that when they do find persons doing things which are not consistent with the legislation, they prosecute them, or they use regulatory devices to fine them or to exclude them from participation in economic activities in the U.S., or they blacklist them. In the case of Guyana, the same applies. The first thing you need to do is to ensure that there are authorities in place, that the authorities are functioning, that the bodies that are in place are qualified, they have the equipment, and they have the necessary relations with partners, that they receive notices from the UN or from banks nearby or their own banks, so that they are aware of what is going on. That has happened. That is happening in Guyana right now. It may not be perfect. I wouldn't like to suggest to you that it's perfect, but it is in place, and it is being implemented with the assistance of a variety of international bodies. So they are there in the system, they know what's going on. If you have a bank account, or let me say to you, if you were a minister and you would find yourself in the financial situation I find myself, and you have to go to the bank and say to them, could you lend me $40,000 please? I'm going to pay you back next week or next month. They're going to say to you, if you were in my case, you are a person of interest, or whatever term they use, and therefore we cannot run the risk of exposure by lending you any money. That is what is happening. So there are various categories. Politicians are one. You have many other categories. You will also know that if you go to the bank and you want a loan, they will ask you to whom you're married, to whom have you been married in the past, where does she get her money from, where does she keep her money, where does she work, a whole set of things that I regard as completely absurd. But all of that is part of the requirement. When you go to the bank has to exercise what they call due diligence. And that due diligence is, in my view, extreme to the point of being absurd. But that is what it is, and that is some of the evidence of what is going on, and what we are required to do. So that is the task that Minister Jordan, the governor of the central bank, the head of the FIU, Mr. What is the name? Langevin, are trying to implement on a daily basis. No, but let me finish the other question, if I may.
It's related to the first, and you'll go on to the second.
Thank you for taking the chair so effectively. Yes.
Minister, at the level of cabinet, when it comes, well, prior to the establishment of the criminal commission, and now, prior you had no objection, contracts and tenders and so on. Can you say with absolute confidence that none of those contracts that have been awarded or noted or so on, whatever process you would say has ever awarded to anyone who was involved or has been identified as being involved allegedly in money laundering?
No, I don't think any state can tell you that. I think the reality today is this, that life is so complicated that people who want to break the law can draw on so many different ways of breaking it, that no state, the United States, let alone, well, let us stick to the West, let us say the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, none of them can tell you that.
But does cabinet take that into consideration?
Yeah, no, what has to, let me answer it differently. Your responsibility is like the police. The police have a charge to stop crime. But you know very well that if somebody is intending to commit a crime, it is either a matter of luck and chance, and only partly a question of efficiency as to whether you can stop that. But what gives people confidence is that once the crime is committed, you will find out, it will be drawn to your attention and you take action, and that you will pursue it unto the logical conclusion. So in relation to the question of the award of tenders, no, we can't say to you that no contract since 2015, let alone, well, no contract since the legislation was passed has been awarded to persons who have been involved in irregularities. But what I'm sure my colleagues who are responsible for such matters will say to you is that we put in place as much of the precautions, as many of the precautions as we can to ensure that that doesn't happen. And where it's drawn to our attention, then between the police and the Attorney General's chambers and the legal framework, they brought into action. Of course, you will also find that people who commit crimes have the wherewithal to retain lawyers to protect them, sometimes as well as other persons to protect them, legally and illegally, within and outside of the political administration. So that is where the challenge lies. But that is the situation as of now. On the EPA, I think, if I might be candid with you, when we were, and here is you, I'm running the risk of parting company with many friends. One of the problems of the EPA and the EPA negotiations has been that after the 1970s, Caribbean academics had lost interest in EPA, in Cotonou, and had not been paying attention to it. Suddenly, in the 1990s, in 2000, in the second millennium, as this process of post-Lomé moved into gear, a lot of them suddenly found an interest in it again. And I'm afraid a lot of misinformation and misapprehension surrounded the analysis. You got a situation in which the Caribbean, having signed an EPA, part of which was to protect them from hazards associated with the uncertainty of development and development assistance and of markets, implemented it, and many governments found themselves cowed by the attacks brought by the academics on and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, on the EPA agreement. So although they've signed it, many countries have done nothing to ensure that they can implement and take advantage of it. And it's like a situation in which you decide, as happened in ancient times, to raid a neighboring village to get yourself either cattle or wives or whatever they used to do. You go through the raid, you lose men, you get beaten up, you sacrifice whatever it is you have to sacrifice, and you get the product. And you just either put it down on the way home or have it in your corral unused. So you've gone through the sacrifice of opening your markets to the EU in relation to certain products, not everything. So you've opened the markets. The EU has opened their markets. Well, you say they had their markets open anyway. They only had their markets open in a certain set of products, mostly agricultural products, not mostly, agricultural products in part, but mostly industrial products. Well, you know we don't yet produce and export trains or airplanes or submarines. But if we did, we could sell those things to the European Union without any barriers. But the things that we produce have either phytosanitary or real barriers. And therefore, we had to negotiate acceptable and appropriate terms and conditions. But more appropriately, for countries such as Guyana, notwithstanding, again, the nonsense said not so much by the, well, by the government at the time, even though it was part of that arrangement, this government in Guyana, the last government, and by the observers, that we don't have any interest in services. In fact, the previous government had contracted consultants to examine Guyana's potential in services. And the consultants had recommended that we did have a potential of competitive advantage in a range of services, and that we should try and enhance infrastructure and facilities to ensure that we could compete. And these have a range of things ranging from technical and professional services, architecture, accountancy, maritime services, and the like, areas that generate a lot of income. Instead of working on these things across the region, because one of the problems, as I was telling you about the banking and borrowing, is that the accountants in Guyana are accountants in Guyana. The regulations that make you an accountant or certify you as an accountant in Guyana are different from those in St. Vincent. They're different from those in Suriname. They're different from those in the Dominican Republic. These are parties to the EPA. And so what we are required to do in order for an accountant here to be able to enter the UK, for example, without unnecessary restrictions, to be able to do business in the UK and to get his income or her income from that process, they have to be registered. And the Caribbean has to be able to say to the EU, here are the requirements on our side for being an accountant, and here is the list of authorized accountants or architects or engineers or whatever, actuaries. We have not been able to do that. We had started when I left the CRNM, OTN, we had started that process for a range of professions. I don't think that's been completed. I don't think that the governments have them, including Guyana government, governments have done the things necessary to ensure that that exercise is completed. So you've opened your market, the EU, and you will see on the shelves in Guyana already all sorts of products appearing on there by virtue of EPA. But you can't go to the UK and find the same thing happening, or you can't go to Denmark and find the same thing happening, because we have not equipped ourselves in order to be able to benefit from it, because people are still somehow afraid that something is wrong. They can't quite put their finger on it, but they know that that debater told them this was an immoral or wrong story. That is our situation. The only country that really has taken this thing seriously and has been working on it, and they can't do it on their own, is the Dominican Republic, and to a lesser extent Trinidad and Tobago. So although I know that I'm going to get beaten up the next time I enter a quoted meeting or a CARICOM meeting for saying this, that is the truth. So one of the things that the EU indicated to us and arising out of our deliberations and previous deliberation is that they are going to try to put in place more measures to help us to take advantage of EPA. But there are many things. You know that we would have done some stuff recently in relation to what is called geographical indications. This has to do with a product. Well, the most obvious one is Demerara sugar being treated as champagne. So champagne comes from a particular region of France. If you grow the same product in Germany or in Buxton, you can't call it champagne. And if it is champagne, it carries a premium in terms of the price. The same thing should apply to Demerara sugar, and I don't know what part of this country you come from, but if it has anything distinctive by way of interesting marketable products, you should have the same facility. But in fact, the European Union and North America account for the bulk, the vast proportion of geographical indication, and the products on those listings all carry premiums. So we are in a situation in which the market and the rules of the market are defined in such a way as to bring advantage to those who are well off and those who control the system. We have to try and take advantage of that, and part of the negotiation within the EPA is to make sure, or has been to make sure, the framework is to make sure that we can also benefit from those things and that the Europeans don't monopolize the market in that way. So that is the situation, and the EU has indicated, and in a number of areas, they have offered to help. Geographical indications, you'll know that we're working with the beverage companies, that is DDL in particular, to ensure, and Gaisuko, to ensure that some of the products that they produce can carry titles specific that the marketing of these products is something from which we could benefit.
Other questions?
Yeah, I take other questions, perhaps a few.
I wanted to know if myself Thomas Stavros, if Guyana could withdraw an advisory to the IAC journal that the referendum be held, will you remain adamant in that stance?
Withdraw a referendum. Well, let me, since you raised it, let me make this point to you. And I make it very, very strongly. That the debate and the public discussion on this matter in Guyana has been little short of ridiculous. I had, maybe a month ago, a press conference in which I was asked, I'm going to tell you a joke. A fellow went, he was an emissary to the Pope, and he was charged with, let us say, some illicit activities, not consistent with being I hope the Catholics amongst us don't get upset, with being a man of the cloth, and was sent away for some years. And after a relevant period of reflection and restitution, he was appointed a bishop in a completely new place. And he arrived at this place and was met by a phalanx of journalists who said to him, Mr. Bishop, will you be visiting any places of ill repute whilst you are on this assignment? And he says, oh, are there places of ill repute here? The next day he was fired because the newspaper headline says, Bishop on landing asks whether there are any places of ill repute. And that is the position in which I find myself. A journalist says to me, Mr. Possibly. Mr. If some of them have their way, Madam Janki and others, I see, I'm asked, will the government be holding a referendum as promised? And I said to them, oh, did the government promise to have a referendum? I'm not aware of that. And I was told, yes, the government promised to hold a referendum and blah, 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 blah. And I said, but I'm not aware of this. I was asked, don't you go to cabinet? I said, well, in truth, I haven't attended every cabinet meeting. It's possible that it happened when I wasn't there, but I'm not aware of such a decision. I was given the assurance that there was such a decision. And I said, well, if this indeed is what happened, the government would honor its commitment. And here I am on the doorstep, like the bishop, having a headline that I got academics from Toronto, Madam Janki from wherever. I get representatives of the LGBT community beating me left and right for deciding. First of all, I never decided. And it is true, cabinet never decided either. Okay? But that is what I'm accused of. Now, what I did discover was that a minister may have said that, and in a document that was presented in New York, the wording may have been perhaps badly put together by the agency that would have sent it. The government took no decision about a referendum. You know, I don't even know when was the last referendum held in this country. Does anybody know who is no, 1980 was the I don't know other than that whether there's been any other referendum. And yet it is that people are... So, it was thrown out, I believe, as just one of the ways of resolving a problem. The matter had been brought to the House. The House could not agree on it. Cabinets, and I'm being accused, it's like the messenger being beheaded. I was trying to explain what are the difficulties that the cabinets face. In other words, you got division in the cabinet, and I'm saying both the current cabinet and the previous cabinet had the same problem arriving at a position. Now, for me to get beaten up for explaining that as though it was my decision, I've taken a position unfavorable, unhelpful, outrageous to human rights is absurd. And we need to wake up. That is why it becomes difficult to participate in any meaningful debate in this country, where people paint you in all sorts of corners in order for them to make their case. You know, you put up a straw man, not that I'm made of straw, but you know, you put up a straw man just so you can beat him up and make out that your case is a virtuous one. You are progressive and modern and informed and so forth. But the reality is that this populace is a mixed one with all sorts of obsessions, perhaps some of them unwarranted, preoccupations and prejudices. That's the reality. And in that sense, it becomes difficult with a free vote in any of these fora to get a decision. So I can't give you any definitive answer to that, because at this point in time, I don't know. I don't know how it will go forward.
So, so I don't put you in a position like the bishop, and that you give me some clarity here. Would you say if there was an advisory to the IACHR, or you're saying that it wasn't?
No, I'm not aware that it was an advisory. We were asked in New York in the course of January, was it? Washington, I got the city wrong. Sometimes this happens. Sorry about that. At a meeting that I don't believe we were actually ready to, in which we were not really ready to participate, but in order to accommodate them, something was quickly put together and sent so that they didn't get the impression that we were wanting to be unhelpful. And you paid the price of doing that. There was a reference to the possibility. I can't remember the exact word that was used, but I read it to mean that, and that surely could have only been the intention, since no decision of that kind was taken. That maybe it will be resolved. It identified that there was a problem, that in the relevant fora, namely the legislature and in the cabinets, there were difficulties in arriving at a conclusion. Maybe it will be resolved by resort to some device such as going back to the public by way of a referendum, for example. I don't think it was anything more than that, and I can't see that I can give you an answer any stronger than that. Yes.
So popular
Well, I don't know as an issue it's popular, but it certainly is controversial. When you say it's popular, what do you mean?
I mean the issue.
You mean it's a controversy. You don't mean it's popular. I don't know what popular means in that regard.
Anyway, I'm asking you.
People like to debate it. That's what you mean.
A lot of people like to debate it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. You ever heard of a redundancy?
You as Minister of Foreign Affairs, would you go back to, for want of a better word, correcting that document that you say was taken out of context?
Well, we will doubtless be called upon by the relevant body, because I'm not even sure to what extent that's a relevant body. Because I don't think we are in any case signatory to. There was some confusion over our standing in the body. That's another thing. But what I would say to you is that when the matter is raised in the appropriate forum again, we will try to have a clearer decision of intent.
And as we're on controversy, any update on Venezuela?
There is no update in Venezuela. We are expecting, now it probably will have to be very, very early in July, not a visit by Mr. Doug Newlander. He has been working on the terms of reference given to him, on the mandate given to him by the Secretary General. He's been here already 3 times, or is it 4? 3 times. and we have tried to ensure that we contribute to the exercise in a manner consistent with our obligations and bearing in mind the requirement to do so in good faith. We have an obligation to speak, to consider anything he proposes, but of course not at the expense of national interest. And I think that is what you would be interested in hearing.
But Minister,
Okay.
to follow up, in light of the political situation in Venezuela, to what extent has we considered the implications of whether the current administration can challenge as far as its legitimacy in participating in the UN process is concerned?
Well, of course, I can't anticipate for the government of Venezuela. At this point in time, there is a legitimate government in Venezuela. It has been elected. It is recognized internationally as the legitimate government, and therefore I assume that the UN is treating with us, cognizant of the implications of a government that may be properly elected but challenged by forces within, constitutionally and otherwise. That is not my problem. That is Venezuela. That is the UN's. Our task as a government is that having entered into an arrangement, first of all in 1966, when Venezuela had no particular problems in that regard, they signed and they said this is the menu. They also said, and it was Venezuela that introduced into the discussions in 1966 in the Geneva Agreement, they introduced the idea that the good office of the Secretary General of the United Nations be used. It was Venezuela. And we are living that agreement. And the agreement doesn't say the SG shall choose only in circumstances where the government in Venezuela or the government in Ghana is popular. It says if the two governments can't agree, and that is the situation, we cannot agree on methods of resolution that will fix the problem or fix the claim that the agreement is null and void. In those circumstances, the SG has one task: to choose from the menu. And what is decided that rather than choosing definitively from the menu, and specifically rather than choosing definitively the ICJ, he will choose the ICJ if between now and the end of November the two sides can't agree on an answer to the question, is this agreement null and void? That is my understanding of what is going on.
But why should the political situation in Venezuela be also concerned to Guyana, and rather than if what governments can do and politicians can do in terms of challenging legitimacy?
Let me simply say this, that Guyana's contention as regards the situation of its territory and its sovereignty arose over a period of time. It arose at times prior to now when there was no internal problem of any consequence as regards Venezuela. So what I'm saying to you is that Venezuela's behavior and its inability to honor its treaty obligations have persisted when the government was being challenged by opposition forces, when it had dictatorships, and when the government was accepted across the region as being a good model of democracy. It doesn't make any difference. That's what I'm saying. In our view, a treaty obligation is a treaty obligation, and in the case of Venezuela, whether or not it has signed an agreement, it has not honored that agreement. And right now, we are in a process that says, notwithstanding that, the SG is trying to ensure some dialogue between us, two-sided or three-sided, and they will, at the end of November, be in a position to decide on what to do. But the position of Guyana on this matter is as I've explained to you. Okay.
One last question.
Robert saying that will certainly provide an update on the aviations. You say why you're being held. I don't know if you addressed this before, but can you say why a visa requirement is still necessary for them to travel to a part of the
Well, let me say to you that the requirements as regards visas are a product of legislation and a product of, if you like, discussion and agreements amongst the CARICOM states. I think a good while ago, certain categories of travelers from Haiti were exempted from visa requirements, namely diplomats, government officials, and the like. Subsequently, it was agreed by Guyana, maybe Guyana and others, that it was possible to issue visas on arrival in certain circumstances. At this point in time, we find ourselves in a situation where Haitians have come to Guyana. They have been landed, in other words, the immigration authorities have let them in, but the police, acting on evidence, have decided that there may be cases involving people trafficking, and therefore they have held some of those persons. What the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been concerned about, and it's drawn this to the attention of the Cabinet, I believe Cabinet accepts it, is that we need to move expeditiously to decide one way or the other whether there is actually evidence, and to try and ensure that children and women who may be in that group in particular are not put in any unacceptable circumstances in terms of conditions, whilst the police try to sort this matter out. That is the situation as of now. The need to be expeditious has been drawn to the attention of the police. Our obligations internationally as regards all migrants has also been drawn to the attention of the police. We have had discussions with in fact, only yesterday, you had a representative of the UNHCR in Guyana, and they had a plan to visit the minister. I called the Minister of Citizenship myself, day before yesterday, to ensure that he would make arrangements to meet them, and I emphasized to them and to him that he and his colleague, that is my colleague, Vice President Ramjatan, acquaint themselves with all our obligations, formal and otherwise, as regards the treatment of migrants. It is of concern to us, the holding of migrants, whether they be from Haiti, Venezuela, or anywhere else, is the subject, therefore, of intense attention by these bodies, and if there is the need for them to come back to us, they will come back to us. But they've been instructed by Cabinet to treat expeditiously with the matters before them, and to go and have a look at the legislation and ensure that if the legislation needs to be modified or updated, it is modified and updated. Let me say in mitigation that except if you look in the 1940s and 1950s, Guyana has not been, in recent times, a destination of significant migrant flows. And therefore, the regulations and legislation have actually not been modified to take account of that. So you're treating everybody as though they are normal travelers or visitors, and if they arrive in large numbers, the police, in this case, and immigration in previous cases, act in a way consistent with the legislation that may not be appropriate for, let us say, large migrant flows, including refugees. Certain categories, of course, the fact that a plane load of people arrives here doesn't mean they're refugees. I'm just saying to you that there are circumstances in which some of them may be refugees or they may ask for refugee status. We have to be sure that where that happens, we are in a position to treat with it properly and expeditiously. And that is a concern. It's a concern drawn to the executing agencies, and they're aware of it and are working on it.
Sir, to the record, did you say which you is aware or are aware of the reports of the adults being separated from children, one, two, their passport being taken away, and if I get mistaken, could you say if these persons are allowed or satisfy the requirement to be granted or permit?
I really can't answer any of those. There are circumstances, of course, in which if you are held by the authorities for immigration breaches, they will hold on to your passports until such time as you are ready to leave, or they put you on a plane, or the matter is cleared. So that is a legitimate, that may well be a legitimate action. But I can't really tell you, and I would prefer that those matters which have to do with implementation and have to do with now what is happening, current status, be addressed to the relevant minister. Because I really don't know, and I don't want to be guessing in an issue as sensitive as this. I don't know whether the SG has any more information in that regard, but that is the situation. I'm not aware. No. It's part of a process. In fact, as they drew to my attention, there was a conference in Trinidad and Tobago in December the 18th, I think, looking at the issue of the region and its handling of migrants, the challenges, what training, what assistance, what support, what legislative changes needed. This was the subject of discussion in December. We weren't part of that. And I did have a discussion with the DG afterwards, as well as last evening with Minister Felix, and we resolved to ensure that we will keep track on those opportunities, and will ensure that in future we participate. But in the meantime, there is, I think, going to be emanating from those agencies a request for assistance. At the moment, clearly, the administrative mechanism governing these arrangements need to be reviewed. This is not a matter to do with the police, in the sense that it's not exclusively a matter to do with the police. It is not nothing. It's nothing. It has nothing to do with citizenship as such. And as regards the state's capacity to deal with and how it handles people once they arrive and are not criminals, it may have to do more with social integration than anything else. So, and of course, since foreigners are involved, it is also a matter for foreign affairs. So the tendency traditionally to treat this matter, oh, it's the immigration or it's police, clearly is not acceptable, it's outdated, it's not relevant to the circumstances, and has to be more carefully examined if these hiccups and perhaps traumas are to be avoided. Okay? Thanks ever so much.